The Man in Lower 10. Chapter 28 to 31, the conclusion to the novel. Chapter 28, Alison's story. She told her story evenly with her eyes on the water, only now and then, when I too sat looking seaward, I thought she glanced at me furtively, and once in the middle of it, she stopped altogether. "You don't realize it, probably," she protested, "but you look like a war god. Your face is horrible." "I will turn my back, if it will help any," I said stormily, "but if you expect me to look anything but murderous, why, you don't know what I'm going through with. That's all." The story of her meeting with the Curtis woman was brief enough. They had met in Rome first, where Alison and her mother had taken a villa for a year. Mrs. Curtis had hovered on the ragged edges of society there, pleading the poverty of the South since the war as a reason for not going out more. There was talk of a brother, but Alison had not seen him, and after a scandal which implicated Mrs. Curtis and a young attaché of the Austrian embassy, Alison had been forbidden to see the woman. The women had never liked her anyhow, she said. She did unconventional things, and they are very conventional there, and they said she did not always pay her gambling debts. I didn't like them. I thought they didn't like her because she was poor and popular. Then we came home, and I almost forgot her. But last spring, when Mother was not well, she had taken Grandfather to the Riviera, and it always uses her up. We went to Virginia Hot Springs, and we met them there. The brother, too, this time. His name was Sullivan, Harry Pinckney Sullivan. I know. Go on. Mother had a nurse, and I was alone a great deal, and they were very kind to me. I saw a lot of them. The brother rather attracted me, partly because he did not make love to me. He even seemed to avoid me, and I was piqued. I had been spoiled, I suppose. Most of the other men I knew had... "I know that too," I said bitterly, and moved away from her a trifle. I was brutal, but the whole story was a long torture. I think she knew what I was suffering, for she showed no resentment. It was early, and there were few people around, none that I cared about, and Mother and the nurse played cribbage eternally, until I felt as though the little pegs were driven into my brain. And when Mrs. Curtis arranged drives and picnics, I slipped away and went. I suppose you won't believe me, but I had never done that kind of thing before, and I have paid up, I think. "What sort of looking chap was Sullivan?" I demanded. I had got up and was pacing back and forward on the sand. I remember kicking savagely at a bit of water-soaked board that lay in my way. "Very handsome, as large as you are, but fair, and even more erect." I drew my shoulders up sharply. I am straight enough, but I was fairly sagging with jealous rage. When Mother began to get around, somebody told her that I had been going about with Mrs. Curtis and her brother, and we had a dreadful time. I was dragged home like a bad child. Did anybody ever do that to you? Nobody ever cared. I was born an orphan, I said, with a cheerless attempt at levity. Go on. If Mrs. Curtis knew, she never said anything. She wrote me charming letters, and in the summer, when they went to Cresson, she asked me to visit her there. I was too proud to let her know that I could not go where I wished, and so I sent Polly, my maid, to her aunt's in the country, pretended to go to Seal Harbor, and really went to Cresson. You see, I warned you it would be an unpleasant story. I went over and stood in front of her. All the accumulated jealousy of the last few weeks had been fired by what she told me. If Sullivan had come across the sands just then, I think I would have strangled him with my hands out of pure hate. "Did you marry him?" I demanded. My voice sounded hoarse and strange in my ears. "That's all I want to know. Did you marry him?" "No." I drew a long breath. "You cared about him?" She hesitated. "No," she said finally. "I did not care about him." I sat down on the edge of the boat and mopped my hot face. I was heartily ashamed of myself, and mingled with my abasement was a great relief. If she had not married him and had not cared for him, nothing else was of any importance. I was sorry, of course, the moment the train had started, but I had wired I was coming, and I could not go back, and then when I got there the place was charming. There were no neighbors, but we fished and rode and motored, and it was moonlight, like this. I put my hand over both of hers, clasped in her lap. I know, I acknowledged repentantly, and people do queer things when it is moonlight. The moon has got me tonight, Alison. If I am a bore, remember that, won't you? Her fingers lay quiet under mine. And so, she went on with a little sigh, I began to think perhaps I cared. But all the time I felt that there was something not quite right. Now and then, Mrs. Curtis would say or do something that gave me a queer start, as if she had dropped a mask for a moment. And there was trouble with the servants. They were almost insolent. I couldn't understand. I don't know when it dawned on me that the old Baron Cavalcanti had been right when he said they were not my kind of people. But I wanted to get away, wanted it desperately. Of course, they were not your kind, I cried. The man was married. The girl Jenny, a housemaid, was a spy in Mrs. Sullivan's employ. If he had pretended to marry you, I would have killed him. Not only that, but the man he murdered, Harrington, was his wife's father, and I'll see him hang by the neck yet, if it takes every energy and every penny I possess. I could have told her so much more gently, have broken the shock for her. I have never been proud of that evening on the sand. I was alternately a bore and a ruffian, like a hurt youngster who passes the blow that has hurt him on to his playmate, that both may bawl together. And now Alison sat, white and cold, without speech. "Married," she said finally in a small voice. "Why, I don't think it is possible, is it? I was on my way to Baltimore to marry him myself when the wreck came." "But you said you didn't care for him," I protested, my heavy masculine mind unable to jump the gaps in her story. And then, without the slightest warning, I realized that she was crying. She shook off my hand and fumbled for her handkerchief, and failing to find it, she accepted the one I thrust into her wet fingers. Then, little by little, she told me from the handkerchief a sordid story of a motor trip in the mountains without Mrs. Curtis, of a lost road and a broken car, and a rainy night when she and Sullivan, tramped eternally and did not get home, and of Mrs. Curtis, when they got home at dawn, suddenly grown conventional and deeply shocked, of her own proud, half-disdainful consent to make possible the hackneyed compromising situation by marrying the rascal, and then of his disappearance from the train. It was so terrible to her, such a heaven-sent relief to me, in spite of my rage against Sullivan, that I laughed aloud, at which she looked at me over the handkerchief. "I know it's funny," she said, with a catch in her breath. "When I think that I nearly married a murderer, and didn't, I cry for sheer joy." Then she buried her face and cried again. "Please don't," I protested unsteadily. "I won't be responsible if you keep on crying like that. I may forget that I have a capital charge hanging over my head and that I may be arrested at any moment." That brought her out of the handkerchief at once. "I meant to be so helpful," she said, "and I've thought of nothing but myself. There were some things I meant to tell you. If Jenny was what you say, then I understand why she came to me just before I left. She had been packing my things, and she must have seen what condition I was in, for she came over to me when I was getting my wraps on to leave and said, 'Don't do it, Miss West. I beg you won't do it. You'll be sorry ever after.' And just then Mrs. Curtis came in, and Jenny slipped out." "That was all?" "No. As we went through the station, the telegraph operator gave Mr. Sullivan a message. He read it on the platform, and it excited him terribly. He took his sister aside, and they talked together. He was white with either fear or anger. I don't know which. Then, when we boarded the train, A woman in black, with beautiful hair, who was standing on the car platform, touched him on the arm and then drew back. He looked at her and glanced away again, but she reeled as if he had struck her. Then what? The situation was growing clearer. Mrs. Curtis and I had the drawing room. I had a dreadful night, just sleeping a little now and then. I dreaded to see dawn come. It was to be my wedding day. When we found Harry had disappeared in the night, Mrs. Curtis was in a frenzy. Then I saw his cigarette case in your hand. I had given it to him. You wore his clothes. The murder was discovered, and you were accused of it. What could I do? And then, afterward, when I saw him asleep at the farmhouse, I was panic-stricken. I locked him in and ran. I didn't know why he did it, but he had killed a man. Someone was calling Allison through a megaphone from the veranda. It sounded like Sam. "Ollie," he called. "Ollie, I'm going to have some anchovies on toast. Ollie." Neither of us heard. I wonder, I reflected, if you would be willing to repeat a part of that story just from the telegram on to a couple of detectives, say on Monday. If you would tell that, and how the end of your necklace got into the sealskin bag. "My necklace," she repeated. "But it isn't mine. I picked it up in the car." "Ollie," Sam again. "I see you down there. I'm making a julep." Allison turned and called through her hands. "Coming in a moment, Sam," she said, and rose. "It must be very late. Sam is home. We would better go back to the house." "Don't," I begged her. "Anchovies and juleps and Sam will go on forever, and I have you such a little time." "I suppose I'm only one of a dozen or so, but you are the only girl in the world. You know I love you, don't you, dear?" Sam was whistling, an irritating bird call, over and over. She pursed her red lips and answered him in kind. It was more than I could endure. "Sam or no Sam," I said firmly, "I am going to kiss you." But Sam's voice came strident through the megaphone. "Be good, you two," he bellowed. "I've got the binoculars." And so, under fire, we walked sedately back to the house. My pulses were throbbing. The little swish of her dress beside me on the grass was pain and ecstasy. I had but to put out my hand to touch her, and I dared not. Sam, armed with a megaphone and field glasses, bent over the rail and watched us with gleeful malignity. "Home early, aren't you?" Allison called when we reached the steps. "Led a club when my partner had doubled no trumps, and she fainted." "Damn the heart convention," he said cheerfully. "The others are not here yet." 3 hours later, I went up to bed. I had not seen Allison alone again. The noise was at its height below, and I glanced down into the garden, still bright in the moonlight. Leaning against a tree and staring interestedly into the billiard room was Johnson. Chapter 29. In the dining room. That was Saturday night, 2 weeks after the wreck. The previous 5 days had been full of swift-following events: the woman in the house next door, the picture in the theater of a man about to leap from the doomed train, the dinner at the Dallases, and Richie's discovery that Allison was the girl in the case. In quick succession had come our visit to the Carter place, the finding of the rest of the telegram, my seeing Allison there, and the strange interview with Mrs. Conway. The Cresson trip stood out in my memory for its serio-comic horrors and its one real thrill. Then, the discovery by the police of the sealskin bag and the bit of chain. Hotchkiss producing triumphantly Stewart for Sullivan and his subsequent discomfiture. McKnight at the station with Allison, and later the confession that he was out of the running. And yet, when I thought it all over, the entire week and its events were two sides of a triangle that was narrowing rapidly to an apex, a point, and the said apex was at that moment in the drive below my window, resting his long legs by sitting on a carriage block and smoking a pipe that made the night hideous. The sense of the ridiculous is very close to the sense of tragedy. I opened my screen and whistled, and Johnson looked up and grinned. We said nothing. I held up a handful of cigars, he extended his hat, and when I finally went to sleep, it was to a soothing breeze that wafted in salt air and a faint aroma of good tobacco. I was thoroughly tired, but I slept restlessly, dreaming of two detectives with Pittsburgh warrants being held up by Hotchkiss at the point of a splint, while Allison fastened their hands with a chain that was broken and much too short. I was roused about dawn by a light rap at the door, and opening it, I found Forbes in a pair of trousers and a pajama coat. He was as pleasant as most fleshy people are when they have to get up at night, and he said the telephone had been ringing for an hour, and he didn't know why somebody else in the blankety-blank house couldn't have heard it. He wouldn't get to sleep until noon. As he was palpably asleep on his feet, I left him grumbling and went to the telephone. It proved to be Richie, who had found me by the simple expedient of tracing Allison, and he was jubilant. "You'll have to come back," he said. "Got a railroad schedule there?" "I don't sleep with one in my pocket," I retorted, "but if you'll hold the line, I'll call out the window to Johnson. He's probably got one." "Johnson!" I could hear the laugh with which McKnight comprehended the situation. He was still chuckling when I came back. "Train to Richmond at 6:30 a.m., I said. "What time is it now?" 4. "Listen, Lolly, we've got him. Do you hear? Through the woman at Baltimore, then the other woman, the lady of the restaurant." He was obviously avoiding names. "She is playing our cards for us. No, I don't know why, and I don't care. But you be at the incubator tonight at 8 o'clock. If you can't shake Johnson, bring him. Bless him." To this day, I believe the Sam Forbeses have not recovered from the surprise of my unexpected arrival, my one appearance at dinner in Granger's clothes, and the note on my dresser which informed them the next morning that I had folded my tents like the Arabs and silently stole away. For at 5:30, Johnson and I, the former as uninquisitive as ever, were on our way through the dust to the station 3 miles away, and by 4 that afternoon we were in Washington. The journey had been uneventful. Johnson relaxed under the influence of my tobacco and spoke at some length on the latest improvements in gallows, dilating on the absurdity of cutting out the former free passes to see the affair in operation. I remember, too, that he mentioned the curious anomaly that permits a man about to be hanged to eat a hearty meal. I did not enjoy my dinner that night. Before we got into Washington, I had made an arrangement with Johnson to surrender myself at 2 the following afternoon. Also, I had wired to Allison, asking her if she would carry out the contract she had made. The detective saw me home and left me there. Mrs. Clopton received me with dignified reserve. The very tone in which she asked me when I would dine told me that something was wrong. "Now, what is it, Mrs. Clopton?" I demanded finally, when she had informed me in a patient and long-suffering tone that she felt worn out and thought she needed a rest. "When I lived with Mr. Justice Springer," she began acidly, her mending basket in her hands, "it was an orderly, well-conducted household. You can ask any of the neighbors. Meals were cooked, and what's more, they were eaten. There was none of this here one day, and gone the next business." "Nonsense," I observed. "You're tired, that's all, Mrs. Clopton. And I wish you would go out. I want to bathe." "That's not all," she said with dignity from the doorway. "Women coming and going here, women whose shoes I am not fit. I mean, women who are not fit to touch my shoes, coming here as insolent as you please and asking for you." "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "What did you tell them? Her, whichever it was." "Told her you were sick in a hospital and wouldn't be out for a year," she said triumphantly. "And when she said she thought she'd come in and wait for you, I slammed the door on her. What time was she here? Late last night, and she had a light-haired man across the street. If she thought I didn't see him, she don't know me." Then she closed the door and left me to my bath and my reflections. At 5 minutes before 8, I was at the incubator where I found Hotchkiss and McKnight. They were bending over a table on which lay McKnight's total armament, a pair of pistols, an elephant gun, and an old cavalry saber. "Draw up a chair and help yourself to pie," he said, pointing to the arsenal. "This is for the benefit of our friend Hotchkiss here, who says he is a small man and fond of life." Hotchkiss, who had been trying to get the wrong end of a cartridge into the barrel of one of the revolvers, straightened himself and mopped his face. "We have desperate people to handle," he said pompously, "and we may need desperate means." Hotchkiss is like the small boy whose one ambition was to have people grow ashen and tremble at the mention of his name, McKnight jibed. But they were serious enough, both of them, under it all. And when they had told me what they planned, I was serious too. "You're compounding a felony," I remonstrated when they had explained. "I'm not eager to be locked away, but, by Jove, to offer her the stolen notes in exchange for Sullivan." "We haven't got either of them, you know," McKnight remonstrated, "and we won't have if we don't start. Come along, Fido," to Hotchkiss. The plan was simplicity itself. According to Hotchkiss, Sullivan was to meet Bronson at Mrs. Conway's apartment at 8:30 that night with the notes. He was to be paid there and the papers destroyed. "But just before that interesting finale," McKnight ended, "we will walk in, take the notes, grab Sullivan, and give the police a jolt that will put them out of the count." I suppose not one of us, slewing around corners in the machine that night, had the faintest doubt that we were on the right track, or that fate, scurvy enough before, was playing into our hands at last. Little Hotchkiss was in a state of fever. He alternately twitched and examined the revolver, and a fear that the two movements might be synchronous kept me uneasy. He produced and dilated on the scrap of pillow slip from the wreck and showed me the stiletto, with its point in cotton, batting for safekeeping. And in the intervals, he implored Richie not to make such fine calculations at the corners. We were all grave enough and very quiet, however, when we reached the large building where Mrs. Conway had her apartment. McKnight left the power on, in case we might want to make a quick getaway, and Hotchkiss gave a final look at the revolver. I had no weapon. Somehow, it all seemed melodramatic, to the verge of farce. In the doorway, Hotchkiss was a half-dozen feet ahead. Richie fell back beside me. He dropped his affectation of gaiety, and I thought he looked tired. "Same old Sam, I suppose?" he asked. "Same, only more of him." "I suppose Allison was there? How is she?" he inquired irrelevantly. "Very well. I did not see her this morning." Hotchkiss was waiting near the elevator. McKnight put his hand on my arm. "Now look here, old man," he said. "I've got 2 arms and a revolver, and you've got 1 arm and a splint. If Hotchkiss is right, and there is a row, you crawl under a table." "The deuce I will," I declared scornfully. We crowded out of the elevator at the 4th floor and found ourselves in a rather theatrical hallway of draperies and armor. It was very quiet. We stood uncertainly after the car had gone and looked at the 2 or 3 doors in sight. They were heavy, covered with metal, and soundproof. From somewhere above came the metallic accuracy of a player piano, and through the open window we could hear or feel the throb of the cannonball's engine. "Well, Sherlock," McKnight said, "what's the next move in the game? Is it our jump or theirs? You brought us here." None of us knew just what to do next. No sound of conversation penetrated the heavy doors. We waited uneasily for some minutes, and Hotchkiss looked at his watch. Then he put it to his ear. "Good gracious!" he exclaimed, his head cocked on one side. "I believe it has stopped. I'm afraid we are late." We were late. My watch and Hotchkiss's agreed at 9 o'clock, and with the discovery that our man might have come and gone, our zest in the adventure began to flag. McKnight motioned us away from the door and rang the bell. There was no response, no sound within. He rang it twice, the last time long and vigorously without result. Then he turned and looked at us. "I don't half like this," he said. "That woman is in. You heard me ask the elevator boy. For 2 cents I had seen it when he did. The door was ajar about an inch, and a narrow wedge of rose-colored light showed beyond. I pushed the door a little and listened. Then, with both men at my heels, I stepped into the private corridor of the apartment and looked around. It was a square reception hall with rugs on the floor, a tall mahogany rack for hats, and a couple of chairs. A lantern of rose-colored glass and a desk light over a writing table across made the room bright and cheerful. It was empty. None of us was comfortable. The place was full of feminine trifles that made us feel the weakness of our position. Some such instinct made McKnight suggest division. "We look like an invading army," he said. "If she's here alone, we will startle her into a spasm. One of us could take a look around and—" "What was that? Didn't you hear something?" The sound, whatever it had been, was not repeated. We went awkwardly out into the hall, very uncomfortable, all of us, and flipped a coin. The choice fell to me, which was right enough, for the affair was mine, primarily. "Wait just inside the door," I directed, "and if Sullivan comes, or anybody that answers his description, grab him without ceremony and ask him questions afterwards." The apartment, save in the hallway, was unlighted. By one of those freaks of arrangement possible only in the modern flat, I found the kitchen first and was struck a smart and unexpected blow by a swinging door. I carried a handful of matches, and by the time I had passed through a butler's pantry and a refrigerator room, I was completely lost in the darkness. Until then, the situation had been merely uncomfortable. Suddenly, it became grisly. From somewhere near came a long-sustained groan, followed almost instantly by the crash of something, glass or china, on the floor. I struck a fresh match and found myself in a narrow rear hallway. Behind me was the door by which I must have come. With a keen desire to get back to the place I had started from, I opened the door and attempted to cross the room. I thought I had kept my sense of direction, but I crashed without warning into what, from the resulting jangle, was the dining table, probably laid for dinner. I cursed my stupidity in getting into such a situation, and I cursed my nerves for making my hand shake when I tried to strike a match. The groan had not been repeated. I braced myself against the table and struck the match sharply against the sole of my shoe. It flickered faintly and went out. And then, without the slightest warning, another dish went off the table. It fell with 1,000 splinterings. The very air seemed broken into crashing waves of sound. I stood still, braced against the table, holding the red end of the dying match, and listened. I had not long to wait. The groan came again, and I recognized it, the cry of a dog in straits. I breathed again. "Come, old fellow," I said. "Come on, old man. Let's have a look at you." I could hear the thud of his tail on the floor, but he did not move. He only whimpered. There is something companionable in the presence of a dog, and I fancied this dog in trouble. Slowly I began to work my way around the table toward him. "Good boy," I said as he whimpered. "We'll find the light, which ought to be somewhere or other around here, and then—" I stumbled over something and I drew back my foot almost instantly. "Did I step on you, old man?" I exclaimed, and bent to pat him. I remember straightening suddenly and hearing the dog pad softly toward me around the table. I recall even that I had put the matches down and could not find them. Then, with a bursting horror of the room and its contents, of the gibbering dark around me, I turned and made for the door by which I had entered. I could not find it. I felt along the endless wainscoting, past miles of wall. The dog was beside me, I think, but he was part and parcel now, to my excited mind, with the thing under the table, and when, After eons of search, I found a knob and stumbled into the reception hall. I was as nearly in a panic as any man could be. I was myself again in a second, and by the light from the hall, I led the way back to the tragedy I had stumbled on. Bronson still sat at the table, his elbows propped on it, his cigarette still lighted, burning a hole in the cloth. Partly under the table lay Mrs. Conway face down. The dog stood over her and wagged his tail. McKnight pointed silently to a large copper ashtray filled with ashes and charred bits of paper. "The notes, probably," he said ruefully. "He got them after all and burned them before her. It was more than she could stand. Stabbed him first and then herself." Hotchkiss got up and took off his hat. "They are dead," he announced solemnly, and took his notebook out of his hatband. McKnight and I did the only thing we could think of, drove Hotchkiss and the dog out of the room, and closed and locked the door. "It's a matter for the police," McKnight asserted. "I suppose you've got an officer tied to you somewhere, Lawrence. You usually have." We left Hotchkiss in charge and went downstairs. It was McKnight who first saw Johnson leaning against a park railing across the street and called him over. We told him in a few words what we had found, and he grinned at me cheerfully. "After a while, in a few weeks or months, Mr. Blakely," he said, "when you get tired of monkeying around with the bloodstain and fingerprint specialist upstairs, you come to me. I've had that fellow you want under surveillance for 10 days. Chapter 30. Finer Details. At 10 minutes before 2 the following day, Monday, I arrived at my office. I had spent the morning putting my affairs in shape and in a trip to the stable. The afternoon would see me either a free man or a prisoner for an indefinite length of time, and in spite of Johnson's promise to produce Sullivan, I was more prepared for the latter than the former. Blobbs was watching for me outside the door, and it was clear that he was in a state of excitement bordering on delirium. He did nothing, however, save to tip me a wink that meant, as man to man, "I'm for you." I was too much engrossed either to reprove him or return the courtesy, but I heard him follow me down the hall to the small room where we keep outgrown law books, typewriter supplies, and incidentally, our wraps. I was wondering vaguely if I would ever hang my hat on its nail again when the door closed behind me. It shut firmly without any particular amount of sound, and I was left in the dark. I groped my way to it irritably to find it locked on the outside. I shook it frantically and was rewarded by a sibilant whisper through the keyhole. "Keep quiet," Blobbs was saying huskily. "You're in deadly peril. The police are waiting in your office, 3 of them. I'm going to lock the whole bunch in and throw the key out of the window." "Come back here, you imp of Satan," I called furiously, but I could hear him speeding down the corridor and the slam of the outer office door by which he always announced his presence. And so I stood there in that ridiculous cupboard, hot with the heat of a steaming September day, musty with the smell of old leather bindings, littered with broken overshoes and handleless umbrellas. I was apoplectic with rage one minute and choked with laughter the next. It seemed an hour before Blobbs came back. He came without haste, strutting with new dignity, and paused outside my prison door. "Well, I guess that will hold them for a while," he remarked comfortably, and proceeded to turn the key. "I've got 'em fastened up like sardines in a can," he explained, working with the lock. "Gee whiz, you'd ought to hear 'em." When he got his breath after the shaking I gave him, he began to splutter. "How'd I know?" he demanded sulkily. "You nearly broke your neck getting away the other time, and I haven't got the old key. It's lost." "Where's it lost?" I demanded, with another gesture toward his coat collar. "Down the elevator shaft." There was a gleam of indignant satisfaction through his tears of rage and humiliation. And so, while he hunted the key in the debris at the bottom of the shaft, I quieted his prisoners with the assurance that the lock had slipped and that they would be free as lords as soon as we could find the janitor with a pass key. Stewart went down finally and discovered Blobs, with the key in his pocket, telling the engineer how he had tried to save me from arrest and failed. When Stewart came up, he was almost cheerful, but Blobs did not appear again that day. Simultaneous with the finding of the key came Hotchkiss, and we went in together. I shook hands with two men who, with Hotchkiss, made a not very animated group. The taller one, an oldish man, lean and hard, announced his errand at once. "A Pittsburgh warrant?" I inquired, unlocking my cigar drawer. "Yes. Allegheny County has assumed jurisdiction, the exact locality where the crime was committed being in doubt." He seemed to be the spokesman. The other, shorter and rotund, kept an amiable silence. "We hope you will see the wisdom of waiving extradition," he went on. "It will save time." "I'll come, of course," I agreed. "The sooner the better. But I want you to give me an hour here, gentlemen. I think we can interest you. Have a cigar?" The lean man took a cigar. The rotund man took 3, putting 2 in his pocket. "How about the catch of that door?" he inquired jovially. "Any danger of it going off again?" Really, considering the circumstances, they were remarkably cheerful. Hotchkiss, however, was not. He paced the floor uneasily, his hands under his coat-tails. The arrival of McKnight created a diversion. He carried a long package and a corkscrew and shook hands with the police and opened the bottle with a single gesture. "I always want something to cheer on these occasions," he said. "Where's the water, Blakely? Everybody ready?" Then in French, he toasted the 2 detectives. "To your eternal discomfiture," he said, bowing ceremoniously. "May you go home and never come back. If you take Monsieur Blakely with you, I hope you choke." The lean man nodded gravely. "Prosit," he said, but the fat one leaned back and laughed consumedly. Hotchkiss finished a mental synopsis of his position and put down his glass. "Gentlemen," he said pompously, "within 5 minutes the man you want will be here, a murderer caught in a net of evidence so fine that a mosquito could not get through." The detectives glanced at each other solemnly. Had they not in their possession a sealskin bag containing a wallet and a bit of gold chain, which, by putting the crime on me, would leave a gap big enough for Sullivan himself to crawl through? "Why don't you say your little speech before Johnson brings the other man, Lawrence?" McKnight inquired. "They won't believe you, but it will help them to understand what is coming." "You understand, of course," the lean man put in gravely, "that what you say may be used against you." "I'll take the risk," I answered impatiently. It took some time to tell the story of my worse-than-useless trip to Pittsburgh and its sequel. They listened gravely, without interruption. "Mr. Hotchkiss here," I finished, "believes that the man Sullivan, whom we are momentarily expecting, committed the crime. Mr. McKnight is inclined to implicate Mrs. Conway, who stabbed Bronson and then herself last night. As for myself, I am open to conviction." "I hope not," said the stout detective quizzically, and then Allison was announced. My impulse to go out and meet her was forestalled by the detectives, who rose when I did. McKnight therefore brought her in, and I met her at the door. "I have put you to a great deal of trouble," I said contritely when I saw her glance around the room. "I wish I had not—" "It is only right that I should come," she replied, looking up at me. "I am the unconscious cause of most of it, I'm afraid. Mrs. Dallas is going to wait in the outer office." I presented Hotchkiss and the 2 detectives, who eyed her with interest. In her poise, her beauty, even in her gown, I fancy she represented a new type to them. They remained standing until she sat down. "I have brought the necklace," she began, holding out a white-wrapped box, "as you asked me to." I passed it, unopened, to the detectives. "The necklace from which was broken the fragment you found in the sealskin bag," I explained. "Miss West found it on the floor of the car, near lower 10. "When did you find it?" asked the lean detective, bending forward. In the morning, not long before the wreck. Did you ever see it before? I'm not certain, she replied. I have seen one very much like it. Her tone was troubled. She glanced at me as if for help, but I was powerless. Where? The detective was watching her closely. At that moment, there came an interruption. The door opened without ceremony, and Johnson ushered in a tall, blond man, a stranger to all of us. I glanced at Allison. She was pale, but composed and scornful. She met the newcomer's eyes full, and caught unawares, he took a hasty backward step. Sit down, Mr. Sullivan, McKnight beamed cordially. Have a cigar? I beg your pardon, Allison. Do you mind this smoke? Not at all, she said composedly. Sullivan had had a second to sound his bearings. No, thanks, he mumbled. If you will be good enough to explain. But that's what you're to do, McKnight said cheerfully, pulling up a chair. You've got the most attentive audience you could ask. These two gentlemen are detectives from Pittsburgh, and we are all curious to know the finer details of what happened on the car Ontario 2 weeks ago, the night your father-in-law was murdered. Sullivan gripped the arms of his chair. We are not prejudiced either. The gentlemen from Pittsburgh are betting on Mr. Blakely over there. Mr. Hotchkiss, the gentleman by the radiator, is ready to place 10-to-1 odds on you, and some of us have still other theories. Gentlemen, Sullivan said slowly, I give you my word of honor that I did not kill Simon Harrington, and that I do not know who did. Fiddle-de-dee! Cried Hotchkiss, bustling forward. Why, I can tell you. But McKnight pushed him firmly into a chair and held him there. I am ready to plead guilty to the larceny, Sullivan went on. I took Mr. Blakely's clothes, I admit. If I can reimburse him in any way for the inconvenience— The stout detective was listening with his mouth open. Do you mean to say, he demanded, that you got into Mr. Blakely's berth, as he contends, took his clothes and forged notes, and left the train before the wreck? Yes. The notes, then? I gave them to Bronson yesterday. Much good they did him. Bitterly. We were all silent for a moment. The two detectives were adjusting themselves with difficulty to a new point of view. Sullivan was looking dejectedly at the floor, his hands hanging loose between his knees. I was watching Allison. From where I stood, behind her, I could almost touch the soft hair behind her ear. I have no intention of pressing any charge against you, I said, with forced civility, for my hands were itching to get at him, if you will give us a clear account of what happened on the Ontario that night. Sullivan raised his handsome, haggard head and looked around at me. I've seen you before, haven't I? He asked. Weren't you an uninvited guest at the Laurels a few days or nights ago? The cat, you remember? And the rug that slipped? I remember, I said shortly. He glanced from me to Allison and quickly away. The truth can't hurt me, he said, but it's devilish unpleasant. Allison, you know all this. You would better go out. His use of her name crazed me. I stepped in front of her and stood over him. You will not bring Miss West into the conversation, I threatened, and she will stay if she wishes. Oh, very well, he said, with assumed indifference. Hotchkiss just then escaped from Richie's grasp and crossed the room. Did you ever wear glasses? He asked eagerly. Never. Sullivan glanced with some contempt at mine. I'd better begin by going back a little, he went on sullenly. I suppose you know I was married to Ida Harrington about 5 years ago. She was a good girl and I thought a lot of her, but her father opposed the marriage. He'd never liked me, and he refused to make any sort of settlement. I had thought, of course, that there would be money, and it was a bad day when I found out I'd made a mistake. My sister was wild with disappointment. We were pretty hard up, my sister and I. I was watching Allison. Her hands were tightly clasped in her lap, and she was staring out of the window at the cheerless roof below. She had set her lips a little, but that was all. You understand, of course, that I'm not defending myself, went on the sullen voice. The day came when old Harrington put us both out of the house at the point of a revolver, and I threatened. I suppose you know that too. I threatened to kill him. My sister and I had hard times after that. We lived on the continent for a while. I was at Monte Carlo and she was in Italy. She met a young lady there, the granddaughter of a steel manufacturer and an heiress, and she sent for me. When I got to Rome, the girl was gone. Last winter, I was all in. Social secretary to an Englishman, a wholesale grocer with a new title, but we had a row and I came home. I went out to the Heaton Boys Ranch in Wyoming and met Bronson there. He lent me money, and I've been doing his dirty work ever since. Sullivan got up then and walked slowly forward and back as he talked, his eyes on the faded pattern of the office rug. If you want to live in hell, he said savagely, put yourself in another man's power. Bronson got into trouble, forging John Gilmore's name to those notes, and in some way he learned that a man was bringing the papers back to Washington on the flyer. He even learned the number of his berth, and the night before the wreck, just as I was boarding the train, I got a telegram. Hotchkiss stepped forward once more importantly, which read, I think, man with papers in lower 10, car 7. Get them. Sullivan looked at the little man with sulky blue eyes. It was something like that anyhow, but it was a nasty business, and it made matters worse that he didn't care that a telegram which must pass through a half-dozen hands was more or less incriminating to me. Then, to add to the unpleasantness of my position, just after we boarded the train, I was accompanying my sister and this young lady, Miss West. A woman touched me on the sleeve, and I turned to face my wife. That took away my last bit of nerve. I told my sister, and you can understand she was in a bad way too. We knew what it meant. Ida had heard that I was going. He stopped and glanced uneasily at Allison. Go on, she said coldly. It is too late to shield me. The time to have done that was when I was your guest. Well, he went on, his eyes turned carefully away from my face, which must have presented certainly anything but a pleasant sight. Miss West was going to do me the honor to marry me, and— You scoundrel! I burst forth, thrusting past Allison West's chair. You infernal cur! One of the detectives got up and stood between us. You must remember, Mr. Blakely, that you are forcing this story from this man. These details are unpleasant, but important. You are going to marry this young lady, he said, turning to Sullivan, although you already had a wife living? It was my sister's plan, and I was in a bad way for money. If I could marry secretly a wealthy girl and go to Europe, it was unlikely that Ida, that is, Mrs. Sullivan, would hear of it. So it was more than a shock to see my wife on the train, and to realize from her face that she knew what was going on. I don't know yet unless some of the servants— well, never mind that. It meant that the whole thing had gone up. Old Harrington had carried a gun for me for years, and the same train wouldn't hold both of us. Of course, I thought that he was in the coach just behind ours. Hotchkiss was leaning forward now, his eyes narrowed, his thin lips drawn to a line. Are you left-handed, Mr. Sullivan? He asked. Sullivan stopped in surprise. No, he said gruffly. Can't do anything with my left hand. Hotchkiss subsided, crestfallen but alert. I tore up that cursed telegram, but I was afraid to throw the scraps away. Then I looked around for lower 10. It was almost exactly across. My berth was lower 7, and it was, of course, a bit of exceptional luck for me that the car was number 7. Did you tell your sister of the telegram from Bronson? I asked. No, it would do no good, and she was in a bad way without that to make her worse. Your sister was killed, think. The shorter detective took a small package from his pocket and held it in his hand, snapping the rubber band which held it. Yes, she was killed, Sullivan said soberly. What I say now can do her no harm. He stopped to push back the heavy hair which dropped over his forehead and went on more connectedly. It was late after midnight, and we went at once to our berths. I undressed, and then I lay there for an hour, wondering how I was going to get the notes. Someone in lower 9 was restless and wide awake, but finally became quiet. The man in 10 was sleeping heavily. I could hear his breathing, and it seemed to be only a question of getting across and behind the curtains of his berth without being seen. After that, it was a mere matter of quiet searching. The car became very still. I was about to try for the other berth when someone brushed softly past, and I lay back again. Finally, however, when things had been quiet for a time, I got up, and after looking along the aisle, I slipped behind the curtains of lower 10. You understand, Mr. Blakely, that I thought you were in lower 10, with the notes. I nodded curtly. I'm not trying to defend myself, he went on. I was ready to steal the notes. I had to. But murder. He wiped his forehead with his handkerchief. Well, I slipped across and behind the curtains. It was very still. The man in 10 didn't move, although my heart was thumping until I thought he would hear it. I felt around cautiously. It was perfectly dark, and I came across a bit of chain, about as long as my finger. It seemed a queer thing to find there, and it was sticky too. He shuddered, and I could see Allison's hands clenching and unclenching with the strain. All at once it struck me that the man was strangely silent, and I think I lost my nerve. Anyhow, I drew the curtains open a little and let the light fall on my hands. They were red, blood red. He leaned one hand on the back of the chair and was silent for a moment, as though he lived over again the awful events of that more than awful night. The stout detective had let his cigar go out. He was still drawing at it nervously. Ritchie had picked up a paperweight and was tossing it from hand to hand. When it slipped and fell to the floor, a startled shudder passed through the room. There was something glittering in there, Sullivan resumed, and on impulse I picked it up. Then I dropped the curtains and stumbled back to my own berth. Where you wiped your hands on the bedclothing and stuck the dirk into the pillow? Hotchkiss was seeing his carefully built structure crumbling to pieces, and he looked chagrined. I suppose I did. I'm not very clear about what happened then, but when I rallied a little, I saw a Russia leather wallet lying in the aisle almost at my feet, and like a fool, I stuck it, with the bit of chain, into my bag. I sat there, shivering, for what seemed hours. It was still perfectly quiet, except for someone snoring. I thought that would drive me crazy. The more I thought of it, the worse things looked. The telegram was the first thing against me. It would put the police on my track at once, when it was discovered that the man in lower 10 had been killed. Then I remembered the notes, and I took out the wallet and opened it. He stopped for a minute, as if the recalling of the next occurrence was almost beyond him. I took out the wallet, he said simply, and opening it, held it to the light. In gilt letters was the name, Simon Harrington. The detectives were leaning forward now, their eyes on his face. Things seemed to whirl around for a while. I sat there almost paralyzed, wondering what this new development meant for me. My wife, I knew, would swear I had killed her father. Nobody would be likely to believe the truth. Do you believe me now? He looked around at us defiantly. I am telling the absolute truth, and not one of you believes me. After a bit, the man in lower 9 got up and walked along the aisle toward the smoking compartment. I heard him go, and leaning from my berth, watched him out of sight. It was then I got the idea of changing berths with him, getting into his clothes, and leaving the train. I give you my word, I had no idea of throwing suspicion on him. Allison looked scornfully incredulous, but I felt that the man was telling the truth. I changed the numbers of the berths, and it worked well. I got into the other man's berth, and he came back to mine. The rest was easy. I dressed in his clothes, luckily they fitted, and jumped the train not far from Baltimore, just before the wreck. "There is something else you must clear up," I said. "Why did you try to telephone me from M... and why did you change your mind about the message?" He looked astounded. "You knew I was at M... he stammered. "Yes, we traced you. What about the message?" "Well, it was this way. Of course, I did not know your name, Mr. Blakely. The telegram said, 'Man with papers in lower 10, car 7, and after I had made what I considered my escape, I began to think I had left the man in my berth in a bad way. He would probably be accused of the crime. So although when the wreck occurred, I supposed everyone connected with the affair had been killed, there was a chance that you had survived. I've not been of much account, but I didn't want a man to swing because I'd left him in my place. Besides, I began to have a theory of my own." As we entered the car, a tall, dark woman passed us with a glass of water in her hand, and I vaguely remembered her. She was amazingly like Blanche Conway. If she, too, thought the man with the notes was in lower 10, it explained a lot, including that piece of a woman's necklace. She was a fury, Blanche Conway, capable of anything. "Then why did you countermand that message?" I asked, curiously. "When I got to the Carter house and got to bed, I had sprained my ankle in the jump. I went through the alligator bag I had taken from lower 9. When I found your name, I sent the first message. Then, soon after, I came across the notes. It seemed too good to be true, and I was crazy for fear the message had gone. At first I was going to send them to Bronson. Then I began to see what the possession of the notes meant to me. It meant power over Bronson, money, influence, everything. He was a devil, that man." "Well, he's at home now," said McKnight, and we were glad to laugh and relieve the tension. Allison put her hand over her eyes, as if to shut out the sight of the man she had so nearly married, and I furtively touched one of the soft little curls that nestled at the back of her neck. "When I was able to walk," went on the sullen voice, "I came at once to Washington. I tried to sell the notes to Bronson, but he was almost at the end of his rope. Not even my threat to send them back to you, Mr. Blakely, could make him meet my figure. He didn't have the money." McKnight was triumphant. "I think you gentlemen will see reason in my theory now," he said. "Mrs. Conway wanted the notes to force a legal marriage, I suppose?" "Yes." The detective with the small package carefully rolled off the rubber band and unwrapped it. I held my breath as he took out first the Russia leather wallet. "These things, Mr. Blakely, we found in the sealskin bag Mr. Sullivan says he left you. This wallet, Mr. Sullivan, is this the one you found on the floor of the car?" Sullivan opened it, and glancing at the name inside, Simon Harrington, nodded affirmatively. "And this," went on the detective, "this is a piece of gold chain?" "It seems to be," said Sullivan, recoiling at the blood-stained end. "This, I believe, is the dagger." He held it up, and Allison gave a faint cry of astonishment and dismay. Sullivan's face grew ghastly, and he sat down weakly on the nearest chair. The detective looked at him shrewdly, then at Allison's agitated face. "Where have you seen this dagger before, young lady?" he asked, kindly enough. "Oh, don't ask me," she gasped breathlessly, her eyes turned on Sullivan. It's too terrible." "Tell him," I advised, leaning over to her. "It will be found out later, anyhow." "Ask him," she said, nodding towards Sullivan. The detective unwrapped the small box Allison had brought, disclosing the trampled necklace and broken chain. With clumsy fingers, he spread it on the table and fitted into place the bit of chain. There could be no doubt that it belonged there. "Where did you find that chain?" Sullivan asked hoarsely, looking for the first time at Allison. "On the floor, near the murdered man's berth." "Now, Mr. Sullivan," said the detective civilly, "I believe you can tell us, in the light of these two exhibits, who really did murder Simon Harrington." Sullivan looked again at the dagger, a sharp little bit of steel with a Florentine handle. Then he picked up the locket and pressed a hidden spring under one of the cameos. Inside, very neatly engraved, was the name and a date. "Gentlemen," he said, his face ghastly, "it is of no use for me to attempt a denial. The dagger and necklace belonged to my sister, Alice Curtis." Chapter 31. And Only One Arm. Hotchkiss was the first to break the tension. "Mr. Sullivan," he asked suddenly, "was your sister left-handed?" "Yes." Hotchkiss put away his notebook and looked around with an air of triumphant vindication. It gave us a chance to smile and look relieved. After all, Mrs. Curtis was dead. It was the happiest solution of the unhappy affair. McKnight brought Sullivan some whiskey, and he braced up a little. "I learned through the papers that my wife was in a Baltimore hospital, and yesterday I ventured there to see her. I felt if she would help me to keep straight, that now, with her father and my sister both dead, we might be happy together. I understand now what puzzled me then. It seemed that my sister went into the next car and tried to make my wife promise not to interfere. But Ida, Mrs. Sullivan, was firm, of course. She said her father had papers, certificates, and so on that would stop the marriage at once. She said also that her father was in our car and that there would be the mischief to pay in the morning. It was probably when my sister tried to get the papers that he awakened, and she had to do what she did. It was over. Save for a technicality or two, I was a free man." Allison rose quietly and prepared to go. The men stood to let her pass, save Sullivan, who sat crouched in his chair, his face buried in his hands. Hotchkiss, who had been tapping the desk with his pencil, looked up abruptly and pointed the pencil at me. "If all this is true, and I believe it is, then who was in the house next door, Blakely, the night you and Mr. Johnson searched? You remember you said it was a woman's hand at the trap door." I glanced hastily at Johnson, whose face was impassive. He had his hand on the knob of the door, and he opened it before he spoke. "There were a number of scratches on Mrs. Conway's right hand," he observed to the room in general. "Her wrist was bandaged and badly bruised. He went out then, but he turned as he closed the door and threw at me a glance of half-amused, half-contemptuous tolerance." McKnight saw Allison with Mrs. Dallas to their carriage and came back again. The gathering in the office was breaking up. Sullivan, looking worn and old, was standing by the window, staring at the broken necklace in his hand. When he saw me watching him, he put it on the desk and picked up his hat. "If I cannot do anything more—" He hesitated. "I think you have done about enough," I replied grimly, and he went out. I believe that Ritchie and Hotchkiss led me somewhere to dinner, and that, for fear I would be lonely without him, they sent for Johnson. And I recall a spirited discussion in which Hotchkiss told the detective that he could manage certain cases, but that he lacked induction. Ritchie and I were mainly silent. My thoughts would slip ahead to that hour, later in the evening, when I should see Allison again. I dressed in savage haste finally, and was so particular about my tie that Mrs. Clopton gave up in despair. "I wish, until your arm is better, that you would buy the kind that hooks on," she protested, almost tearfully. "I'm sure they look very nice, Mr. Lawrence. My late husband always—" "That's a lover's knot you've tied this time," I snarled, and jerking open the bow knot she had so painfully executed, looked out the window for Johnson, until I recalled that he no longer belonged in my perspective. I ended by driving frantically to the club and getting George to do it. I was late, of course. The drawing room and library at the Dallas home were empty. I could hear billiard balls rolling somewhere, and I turned the other way. I found Allison at last on the balcony, sitting much as she had that night on the beach, her chin in her hands, her eyes fixed unseeingly on the trees and lights of the square across. She was even whistling a little, softly. But this time the plaintiveness was gone. It was a tender little tune. She did not move as I stood beside her looking down, and now, when the moment had come, All the 1,001 things I had been waiting to say forsook me, precipitately beat a retreat, and left me unsupported. The arc moon sent little fugitive lights over her hair, her eyes, her gown. "Don't do that," I said unsteadily. You know what I want to do when you whistle." She glanced up at me and she did not stop. She did not stop. She went on whistling softly, a bit tremulously, and straightway I forgot the street, the chance of passers-by, the voices in the house behind us. "The world doesn't hold anyone but you," I said reverently. "It is our world, sweetheart. I love you." And I kissed her. A boy was whistling on the pavement below. I let her go reluctantly and sat back where I could see her. "I haven't done this the way I intended to at all," I confessed. "In books, they get things all settled and then kiss the lady." "Settled?" she inquired. "Oh, about getting married and that sort of thing," I explained with elaborate carelessness. We could go down to Bermuda, or Jamaica, say in December." She drew her hand away and faced me squarely. "I believe you are afraid," she declared. "I refuse to marry you unless you propose properly. Everybody does it, and it is a woman's privilege. She wants to have that to look back to." "Very well," I consented with an exaggerated sigh. "If you will promise not to think I look like an idiot, I shall do it, knee and all." Illustration: I had to pass her to close the door behind us, but when I kissed her again, she protested that we were not really engaged. I turned to look down at her. "It is a terrible thing," I said exultantly, "to love a girl the way I love you, and to have only one arm." Then I closed the door. From across the street there came a sharp crescendo whistle, and a vaguely familiar figure separated itself from the park railing. "Say," he called in a hoarse whisper, "shall I throw the key down the elevator shaft?" The end.